Hey, class. So this is pardon me, the podcast for week two, the introduction for week two of the semester. And what I have on the screen in front of me is the week two module, which I'm going to release in just a few minutes after I record this podcast. Here are the couple of big themes that I want to introduce this week. And kind of keep that in mind. Remember how I suggest you study for this course and how I try to teach it. It's like a narrative, a plot, a story, a big picture that you fit the details in. And one of the first big picture points I want to make is something that I'll talk about a lot over the next couple of weeks, is the fact that the Spanish are never really that successful in populating Texas to any large degree. There's a saying, to populate is to govern. And the Spanish don't really ever have that many people in Spanish Texas until 1821. And in fact, as late as 1821, there's only about 4,000 folks of European descent in Texas. 4,000. UTSA is like 30,000. Now, there were probably, and we don't know for sure, between 25,000 and 30,000-ish Indians in Texas during this period. But as late as 1821, only 4,000 people of European descent. So that's the big point, one of the big points I want to make. The Spanish never come into Texas in large numbers. Now, I'm going to talk about this in great detail in my podcast. You'll hear this over and over again. But the reason for this, there's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, Texas didn't have much mineral wealth. So from the point of view of the Spanish who tended to consolidate around Mexico City, there was no reason to come up here. There was no gold, there was no silver in Texas, unlike Peru and Mexico City. The other thing is that Texas was really far away from Mexico City, which is where most people in colonial Mexico wanted to be. There wasn't a strong frontier mentality in Spanish Mexico, and most folks wanted to be in Mexico City, which by 1821 is the largest city in the world, by the way. And then the third thing is that the native groups in Texas, the indigenous groups, the Indian groups in Texas, they were just too tough for the Spanish, especially the Comanche. The Comanche were much more powerful in Texas than were the Spanish. The Apache, the Lipan Apache, were also very difficult for the Spanish to deal with as well. And this is a theme I'm going to develop. Now, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because the Comanche don't come on the scene here until the 1720s. But again, the three main points. The Spanish don't populate Texas to any large degree. There's no mineral wealth up here. It's too far away from Mexico City, and the Indian groups are too tough. And they're not really seen, with the exception of the Caddo, as being good candidates for conversion to Christianity. So keep that point in mind. And having said that, the Spanish don't populate Texas to any big, significant degree, I also want to say at the same time, the Spanish leave a mark on Texas that it still makes Texas, Texas. The cattle industry, that comes from the Spanish period. The vaquero, the cowboy, that was originated in the Spanish period. Mexican food, what we call Mexican food, the origins of that started during the Spanish period. Every river in Texas has a Spanish name: the Frio, the Colorado, the Rio Grande, the Sabine, the Nueces. The one exception is the Red River. So rivers in Texas have Spanish names. Geological features have Spanish names as well. Spanish law still influences Texas in ways that I'll talk about, especially the rights that women have in Texas. Women in Spanish Texas actually had more rights than women in colonial New England, and I'll talk about this in a later podcast in a couple of weeks. San Antonio where you're going to school right now. That's a legacy of the Spanish period. So two things are both simultaneously true. The Spanish never populate Texas to any great degree, but the Spanish leave a permanent mark on Texas. Okay, so keep that in mind. And the fact that the Spanish don't populate Texas to any significant degree, that's going to make Texas very vulnerable to incursions from the United States after Texas becomes Mexican in 1821. That's a date you're going to have to know. So the fact that the Spanish don't populate Texas means that it's kind of ripe for the picking by the United States beginning in the 1820s. But now I'm getting way ahead of myself. Okay, so that's one of the big picture items that I want to talk about. The second one, and we'll start talking about this week, are the significance of the Comanche in Texas. And I'll show you a quick map. See here. Here's the Comancheria. The Comancheria basically is an empire that the Spanish had in Northwest Texas, Eastern New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Colorado from the 1720s, really, in Texas until the late 1870s. So you had an empire within what's now the United States. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about the Comanche and the Comancheria this semester. So the importance of the Comanche, but I just want to signal you that the Comanche in Texas are far more powerful than the Spanish in Texas. We tend to think about Europeans as always defeating the Indians. It's not true when it comes to the Comanche-Spanish encounters in Texas. And Anglo-Texans don't defeat the Comanche until the 1870s. Okay, so I've thrown a lot of stuff at you there. Big picture. Spanish don't populate Texas to any big degree, but they leave a permanent mark on Texas, and the Spanish period helps make Texas, and the significance of the Comanche. Okay, I'm going back now to the content page for week 2, and I want to make a point. Usually my podcasts, I try to consolidate them into one big podcast, but it didn't work for week 2. So there's 3 podcasts that you have to listen to. The first podcast begins, it talks about the French in Texas. They come here by mistake, and it freaks out the Spanish. And one of the other points that I want to make is that the Spanish never pay attention to Texas unless they feel Texas is threatened. It's the only time the Spanish pay attention to Texas. And beginning in the 1680s, the French seem to be moving into Texas, and the Spanish freak out. And that begins the fall of dominoes that leads to the creation of San Antonio. So you can see the first podcast talks about the French presence in Texas. Then I have a very short podcast 2, which is a standalone podcast. And then a longer podcast 3, week 2, which talks about the Spanish finally leaving their imprint on Texas. So this week, I didn't honestly do a great job of creating a seamless one podcast. You'll have to listen to 3 podcasts. The second one's very, very short. So sorry about that, but that's just the way it worked out. And the podcast for the rest of the semester, they're not quite as jagged as the podcast for week 2 this semester. Yeah, if you have any problems with that, email me. But again, these are the 3, and you can see in front of me the 3 podcasts for this semester. The first one, which is longish, second one very short, and then the third one, which is longish as well, about the Spanish settlement of Texas. Now, the other thing I want you to know about this is I have an outline here. Sometimes I do an outline. Sometimes I do a keyword. And that's just to let you know what you're going to see or hear really in the podcast. And so you might want to kind of cut and paste the outline or the keywords before you listen to the podcast. And one of the things that you're going to find out is I quiz you. If I talk about something and it appears in a keyword I talk about in the podcast, there's a high chance that you'll be tested on it. as I've said a bunch of times, I'm very, very clear about what I want you to know in this class. And I try to make it very clear to you what you need to learn. I hate surprises. I know students hate surprises. I think it's crappy teaching, actually, to try to surprise students. So I try to like pitch my lectures right down the middle so you know exactly what it is that you need to know for the quizzes and the midterms. So I'm always amazed. Keep an idea, keep a sense of the outline. In this case, it's kind of a keyword. If you know the keywords and you know the outline, you're going to do great in this course. I'm always amazed that students don't take advantage of this. Just write it down, and then if you see, and then I'll explain it in the podcast, and then just note to yourself in your notes what it is that I'm talking about. I'm not trying to trick you. Again, I'm trying to tell you a story. I'm trying to keep it interesting. I'm trying to keep it lively, because I know for a bunch of you, history has been taught poorly. Not always. There's great K through 12 history teachers out there. My kids have had some, but they've also had some pretty lousy ones too. So I'm trying to take what students hate about history and not repeat those mistakes, let you know what you need to know. There are some facts and dates that you need to know. And in these keywords, I'm signaling you, okay, you may not like this. This is what you don't like about history, but suck it up. This is what you need to know if you want to do well in this course. Okay, so those are the podcasts. The other thing is, I have a Gwyn orientation. You're starting to read the Gwyn book. I divided up the Gwyn book. He doesn't talk chronologically, and it was a little confusing. So I divided it up so you confront that material chronologically. So what you have here is the Gwyn review. I try to introduce you to Gwyn, the map of the Comancheria, which I showed you before. The last thing I'll say is that, and I'll talk about this in the announcement I send out. I'm cutting this, or I'm postponing the second half of the Gwyn reading from, I think, chapter 5. I'm postponing that till next week because it talks about some historical incidents that I don't talk about in my podcast until next week. So the part on the San Saba, the destruction of the San Saba mission, I talk about that in the podcast in week 3, and I'm postponing that reading for next week. And I'll make that clear in my announcement, what I want you to read for this week and what I want you to read for next week. Now, on the syllabus, it says it's all of those 2 chapters, and there's no reading for next week. So you can read all that information this week, but I think it'll make a lot more sense next week because it'll pair Gwyn and what he's talking about. That'll be paired with my podcast, and I think it'll make a lot more sense to you. So I'll put on the announcement what the Gwyn reading that's relevant for this week, just so you don't feel like you're wasting your time. As always, any questions or concerns or confusion, please reach out to me.